All right, I want to play this. Mark Schlereth talked about Dan Campbell. And they basically discussed it on Breakfast Ball, which is a show on FS1. And the topic was expect the Lions to take a step back this season, ? And they talked about the Lions taking a step back with the new coordinator. So here's Mark Schlereth, the legend. He'd be great to get on the show, by the way.
We should. That would be sick.
Dude, he's very, very smart. Talked about Dan Campbell and why people might be sleeping on what he does offensively. So unfortunately, the clip that we were going to play is copyrighted. So therefore, we can't play it, but you can click on the link in the description. I put the clip there so you guys can see the full context. And then we're going to be reacting to the clip after this video is done. But I had to just tell you guys, no clip, copyright strike. We don't want that. It's basically Mark Schlereth on FS1 discussing how Dan Campbell, underrated offensive mind, and how him being there, his presence, you're not so much worried about the regression of this offense. But check out the clip for the context. Now let's get back to the video. Sorry for the inconvenience. So here's the thing. Very simple question. Are we underestimating Dan Campbell's involvement or his impact on offense? And are we worrying too much about John Morton? Because I will say this about Dan Campbell. All right. And I think I've been pretty consistent about this. I think Dan Campbell is an offensive-minded guy. He's a former tight end. I think the meathead thing is probably worn out at this point. I don't even want to go there and be like, he's not a meathead. Everyone understands that. He's a very smart dude. Offensive-minded. I think Dan knows his strengths and weaknesses like every good leader does. And Dan understands, I'm an offensive mind, but I don't want to be a play caller. You know, it's not really my, some coaches would like to take it. Ben Johnson's he is the play caller in Chicago. Sean McVay is the play caller. Andy Reid is, Kyle Shanahan is, all that stuff. There's plenty more. Dan Campbell's a little different. He wants to be the CEO. He wants to be involved on both sides of the ball, having his input. And the best description of it, or the best example I've used, is the painting example, where it's like he tells his OC, who's the Van Gogh, what to paint. You know, he tells them this is what I want it to look like. And Ben Johnson just happened to be just masterclass painter. So you got to see it like, oh, this is amazing, but it's Dan's imagery or Dan's idea. That's where I think where I'm at is the tough part about this conversation is when Ben's here, we can say that. When Ben leaves, especially to the Bears, it turns into this conversation of, it was all Dan. It wasn't even Ben. It was all Dan. It wasn't even Ben. They're going to be fine. It was all Dan. It wasn't Ben. Now that Ben's gone. But those same people, when John Morton steps in, and hypothetically, in an imaginary land, if John Morton doesn't work out, what are those people going to say? John Morton's an idiot.
It's not Dan. It's John
not
Morton.
Dan. It's John Morton. He's the idiot. That's my problem is if we're going to do that, we got to be consistent with it too. So that's where I'm at. I don't want to discount Dan. I think he's going to be in the room with John, just like John was here with Ben, and they're going to be on the same page. And Dan's going to say, hey, John, remember we did this? You remember we like this? We see that? Yeah, okay. And then they do it, and I think it'll be fine. But please, can we refrain from the glaze? Like Dan is this Andy Reid clone in John Morton's. If it works, Dan Campbell gets all the credit, but if it doesn't, John Morton's to blame. That's all I'm saying. Okay, so I don't think Mark Schlereth is wrong by any means, but it isn't all Dan.
I will say this.
Come on.
And you know what, Jeff? And you can, I want you to hold me accountable if you think anything I say is wrong here.
Okay, go ahead.
I feel like I have been personally, especially in kind of the fan base of the more optimistic side of things over the last 2 or 3 years. I have been very consistent on both Ben Johnson being able to be, and I've always said it, I think he was one of the best OCs in the game over the last 2 years. And I've said that a million times. But on the opposite side of that, this is where you can hold me accountable, because I know I've been saying this for years now, is I have also given Dan Campbell, and I have stuck up for Dan Campbell for people who tried to say Dan Campbell doesn't get it, or Dan Campbell doesn't have an imprint. This is all Ben Johnson. Because I think this thing goes, it's a miracle round or whatever those things are called, merry-go-rounds or whatever.
Yep.
Miracle round sounds sick, but it's one of those where it's like people are going to have their side and they're not going to budge at all, and they're just going to sit. I'm a Ben Johnson guy. I'm a Dan Campbell guy. No one's budging. Listen, why can't it be both? I truly believe this, and the only argument that people have is, the Anthony Lynn thing. The Anthony Lynn thing, and I'll say this, Jeff, and this is where you could say, hey, Boone, that was bad. That was Dan Campbell's first year on the job. And with that, we have said it a million times. If we're going to use the Anthony Lynn example, let's hold each other accountable and be consistent. That was one of the worst rosters in NFL history that they took over that year.
Yeah, no, it was.
So you could say Anthony Lynn, you could say all that. Yeah, I agree. He was bad. But Dan in the room, and Anthony Lynn's a good friend of Dan Campbell's, for Dan to step up and say this is not working. Like, it's not the fact that Dan wasn't the offensive mastermind. None of that. Dan hired one of his friends to be an OC and quickly realized, hey, this isn't how I want to run my offense. And you know who stepped up and said something? Dan Campbell did. And Dan Campbell said, we're going our different ways. He didn't instantly say, hey, Ben, this is your offense. Dan stepped in and slowly, again, with a not so great roster, slowly started to kind of implement his own offensive ways and verbs and strategies. And that offseason, they bring Ben and they say, Ben, you're the new OC. And that offseason, they sit down with Jared Goff and Dan Campbell and guess who else? John Morton. And they sit down and they go, okay, let's build an offense. And it wasn't just Ben Johnson in there being like, this is what we're doing. No, this was Ben Johnson, Dan Campbell, John Morton, and Jared Goff. So I got in this argument in a different YouTube chat of people being like, it's 100% or it's 75% Dan Campbell's offense, 10% Ben Johnson's. No, let's call it what it is. These guys sat in a room in that offseason and they all had a hand in making this offense. And you know what I would say, Jeff? 25% across the board. All four of those guys, even including Jared Goff, deserve 25%. They all sat in there and they implemented it. Now, the one thing I'm going to give Ben Johnson very good credit as is he got very good at play calling and knowing when to call certain plays. And he did have his lumps. He had his down the stretch last year. We know that. Third downs were a little questionable at times and some of the play calls. But he also he was very good in certain moments at play calling and knowing what the roster he had, what he was able to do. But people will also forget, Jeff, that there was a press conference over the last year when they asked Dan Campbell, how much are you involved in this offense? And they asked Ben the same question. And what did they both come out and say? Dan Campbell at the start of every single week writes his game plan for the offense, puts his game plan together, puts everything that he wants his offense to be doing that week versus that opponent. And he hands it to Ben Johnson and says, this is what I want. And Ben Johnson puts his little touch to it and changes things up. And then he's the play caller. But this thing comes from from Dan Campbell. Like, and I get it, Jeff. I'm not going to take away from Ben at all because you know how I feel about Ben Johnson. But I think with how good the offense was the last 2 years, I think a lot of the credit always does go to the OC if the head coach is not calling plays. Where I think in this case, it's Dan Campbell. It's a Dan Campbell offense, and we've seen it continuously. That's where I think I'm a little bit more optimistic than most people like Klotz and other people who think that John Morton taking this over, it's going to be a step back. Like, is it a step back? Sure. They might go from number one offense to number four. This offense isn't going to take a step back like people think. Like, it really isn't. You have 3 out of the 4 guys that were in that room and built this offense still. 3 out of the 4, Jeff. You had 3 out of the 4 last year as well. Except you just now have John Morton. And yeah, John Morton can mess play calling up, but I think this team is just so good to where even if he does, this team's going to overcome it.
Hey, what's going on there? It's Jeff Iafrate. Appreciate you for finishing the video. You can check out one of the videos here suggested or show support by commenting, liking, and subscribing. And buy your merchandise, officialctsports.com.